Hi, my name's Rebecca Johnston and I'm a textile artist based in the UK. I'm interested in slow stitching, hand quilting and also creative ways to use up fabric offcuts. So in this video I'm going to be showing you how to make a pair of abstract coasters or mini quilts using up any little scrappy pieces of fabric that you may have from other projects. The video is very organic. I've tried to stay as true to my creative process as possible. So it's not slick, it's not very polished, but it's very much how I work. In the video I'll talk you through my colour choices, how I select fabrics, and you'll see me generally just kind of solving problems and working things out as I go along. If you're someone who maybe struggles with finding their creative voice, maybe you prefer to use step-by-step instructions, or you like something that has a very specific outcome, then this might be for you because it's a much freer way of working, and I hope that you'd come away from this feeling confident in your own artistic ability and able to work in a way that's maybe slightly freer and slightly loosely ended. So I'm going to talk you through some mini quilts that I've made. You may have seen some of these on Instagram. They've all got slightly different techniques, but they're all made from using scrap fabrics and without much thought. So I've tried to make these in a fairly organic way. So with this pair, just using scrap fabrics and not really altering the shape too much. And placing them in a way that I think complements each other and reveals some negative space. They're very simple. It can be tempting to overwork it, but I tend to just use 2 or 3 colours and then with the hand stitching kind of echo the shapes but maybe change the direction or change the scale. So yeah, a really simple pair of coasters that really work nicely together, and they can be functional, or you know, they look nice hanging on the wall, maybe framed, depending on how you like to frame your artwork. It looks really nice combined with other pieces. And then another one, this is kind of an irregular shape, which was fun. A background pieced together, 2 background pieces, and then these little shapes on top have been needle turn appliqued, and I've used the same weight of thread for the needle turn that I have with the hand quilting. Sometimes I'll like to make my stitching invisible, other times I think it's quite nice and sort of quite charming to show the hand of the maker. And then the contrasting backing, which has been folded over, just gives it a really nice element with that sort of pinstripe there. And then the quilting is in 2 different directions as well. So that was quite a fun one to make. This one's one of my favourites. Again, just really, really simple. 3 colours, but in varying tones, or the same colour in 3 tones. Scrap fabrics, kind of haphazardly folded over. And then this side I left the edge raw, and I do like to play around with leaving some edges raw and some edges folded over. And then with the hand stitching I cut along, didn't give it much thought. It is fraying. I mean, it's not a functional quilt, so I'm not too concerned about that, and I like the way that will kind of fray and sort of dissolve over time. But yeah, there's something quite fun about these shapes. I really like the negative space, and I like being able to see my slightly clumsy stitching there. And another sort of similar, these are colours that I use quite a lot. This sort of deep blue, and then a crew background and sort of grey blue stitching as well. Again, I was just laying down the fabrics, just sort of seeing how they look when things are further together or closer, and just adding decorative stitching into the shapes. So tools and materials. To make a coaster that is 12 by 12 centimetres, you will need some wadding. I've got 2 squares of cotton wadding here. You can use whatever you prefer, but I like this one. It's a natural fibre and it's quite thin as well. You'll need 2 pieces of fabric for your top and 2 pieces of fabric for your background. I've used the same colour. You can contrast them if you like. You can use 2 different ones for a pair of coasters that will have different backgrounds, or you can use the same, or you could even piece the backgrounds together from different colours like I have done here, ready to do your design on the top. Just realise that I'm using the metric system, so 12 centimetres in inches is about 4 3/4. Your background is 16 centimetres, that's about 6.5 inches, and 2 centimetres works out as about 3/4. So apologies if you're not used to working in centimetres, I'll try to remember to switch them. So these are your fabrics for your background, which will fold over like we've done here to form the border, and then the fabric for your top, which will then add some scrap fabrics on the top and stitch into. You'll want some needles. I'm not too faithful with any particular type or brand of needle, but when I'm hand quilting I tend to use either a sashiko or a milliner's needle, just because they're a little bit longer and I like to gather up my threads. When I'm doing needle turn applique, or when I'm sewing the border, I tend to use something a little bit smaller. Obviously you want to make sure that the hole is big enough to fit your choice of thread. When I'm quilting, I like to use pearl size 8. I find, pearl cotton doesn't tangle as easily as some other cottons, and it's nice and strong. It gives a nice sort of contrasty stitch definition. I will sometimes use that for needle turn applique, or if I want that to be more invisible, I'll just use a standard sewing thread and match that to the colour of the fabric. I usually match it to the top fabric rather than the background fabric. It tends to disappear more easily that way. But again, you might want to use a contrasting fabric and make a feature of those stitches. That is entirely up to you. And then finally, I've got a selection of scrap fabrics, and I'll need to give these a little bit of an iron and start seeing what interesting shapes they hold. Right then, so I've got my 2 neutral coloured backgrounds. This is a linen cotton mix. Most of these fabrics are linen or linen cotton mix, and maybe 1 or 2 of them are 100% cotton. And I'm just going to start to place shapes together and just see if anything interesting happens, if anything catches my eye. Ooh, that's very bold, much bolder than I'm used to. I always like to start off a project this way, and obviously I'm filming this now, but I would either film it or take lots of photos as I go along, and then I can go back and review that footage, because it's quite easy to forget and kind of get lost in the moment with this. So I'm really enjoying these shapes, and I obviously won't use all of these fabrics because that would be too cluttered, and space is quite an important element in my work. And I also like to leave a bit of space for stitching, because that does change things as well. So having a think, something about these colour combinations and these shapes that are making me think of a circus. Maybe it's this leftover from a patchwork hanging, reminds me a bit of the circus tents, or something about the beach perhaps, these kind of bold colours together. Maybe it's that blue and that yellow as well, reminds me of sailing or the sea. I really want to use this beautiful frayed edge somewhere. So there will be about 1 centimetre, that's probably 1/4 of an inch-ish, which will be overlapped with the border, like on this one. So you don't want to have anything sort of too prominent going off the edge. But I do like my designs to kind of sneak off the edges a little bit. So yeah, so if I put that up too high, that bit would get lost. So if I bring that down a little bit, that might work. I'm also thinking, because we're making a pair of coasters here, how they'd be viewed as a pair. So there's kind of a nice visual relationship between these two shapes here, even though the colours are very different. Okay, maybe that blue's too bold. I could even cut this one in half if I wanted both of them to have that colour in. I'm not sure just yet. Let's have a look. It's quite a soft colour. So I might just go ahead and speed this bit up because I don't want to rush it, and then I'll slow it down again when I found my particular combination. So I think I found a combination, a layout that I'm happy with. It might be a bit too much. We'll see what happens as we're sewing it along. There's just something about this dark fabric that kind of pulls the two together that I like. I also wanted to use this, but again, it might be too much. I might stitch these down and then see how I feel a little bit later, and I can always add more. So what I need to do now is just kind of cut off any excess fabric so it fits in with my top bit of fabric frame there. So you could, might be easier to have done that with a rotary cutter, but I don't want to ruin the layout, so I'm going to very carefully just snip off those edges there. And obviously these will be used for another project at a later date. So as you can see, I work in quite a haphazard way, not too accurate, no measuring for me. That's quite fun, isn't it? That might be used somewhere. So it's just so inspiring working this way because you don't know what's going to happen, like all these fun little shapes. You know, that is really lovely. That might be something I return to later on. And yeah, the benefit of recording that is that process isn't lost. Okay, so there's the final pairing. Knowing me, I might tweak that slightly. I feel like maybe I want to put some of this on there now. Yeah, so oh, that's nice. It's not an exact science. No, that's too much. I'll take that one out. So yeah, have a little play with yours and see what shapes come together. The first thing that I want to do is secure some of these fabrics down. So I'm going to work on this one. You could pin them down if you like. I'm going to attempt to remember this composition, so I'm just going to take those off, and then I'm just working with this shape here. I'm just going to pop a little pin in the middle of this one. I've got just some sewing thread. It's not exactly the same colour as the background, but it doesn't matter too much. And I'm just going to whip stitch this on, and that way I can keep these beautiful frays here. So sometimes I will just use a running stitch, and I'm not being too careful with it, because often I will have quilting stitches that will keep your shapes down in place anyway. But because this is quite a open weave, I don't want it to fray too much, so using the using the whip stitch will keep that in place and stop some of the fraying. So I'm not being too neat with this one. The gaps are slightly irregular, and the stitches maybe a little bit larger than I would use if I was appliquing. I might use slightly smaller stitches around the top here just to keep some of that fraying down. So you use the quilter's not there, but I think that's not going to be secure enough, so I'll just knot it around the last stitch. There we go. Okay, so that one is secured down. You can just about see the stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same with these two shapes. Just whip stitching them down, especially important on this very, very thin edge. So I'm going to, probably almost wrap around the whole of that bit of fabric with my stitches there. Whoops. So I will speed that up. So you can see here where this part is going to be, the binding will be folded over, so I've not bothered stitching that bit down. Now I need to go ahead and do the other part. I think I had it like that before, but I'm starting to enjoy it like this now. I might change it because I can. There we go, so that's the first top made. At this stage as well, it's quite nice to explore how they would look together if they were pieced as a quilt. Imagine lots and lots and lots of these blocks, all with different found shapes. That could be a really fun project as well, maybe on a slightly larger square to keep it manageable. Right, so one down. We need to look at this one next and think about how we're going to put these down. I'm wondering if I just reduce the size of that background a little bit. Yeah, and maybe needle turn applique that. So I'm just going to trim actually go on there, maybe think about that. Right, yes, so I think what I want to do is needle turn applique this edge down here. So it's a little bit tricky to do without losing the position of everything, so I'm going to pin these down first. So there's lots of different ways to do needle turn applique. Some people use paper cutout shapes and then fold it around, or that nice wax paper that you can iron onto fabric and then fold the edges over. Depending on what shape I'm doing, I tend to just kind of finger crease. So I'm going in about 1 centimetre, maybe 3/4 of an inch. That's 1/2 inch, isn't it? Between 1/4 and 1/2 inch. And with needle turn applique, it's quite tricky on linen if it's a very heavy linen. So I tend to use linen cotton mixes. The cotton gives it a little bit more stability. And anything with a kind of open weave as well, it doesn't have such a defined shape. So that's something to bear in mind when you're deciding what techniques to use. If the fabric's too thick, then that's really hard. It's okay if it's a kind of larger shape and if it's got straighter lines, but if you're trying to do, I don't know, a small shape like a star or something, then that would be really tricky. There. So I've just pre-folded my edge over. And I'm going to leave this edge raw here, because I quite like that. So what I will do then is whip stitch here to secure that down, and then do the same stitch as I did in this one here, make them slightly bigger to get those frays. And I'm probably going to use kind of off-white, the same colour as that one there, and maybe try and concentrate my stitches in the white bits so it's not as visible. So I'm actually going to sew this against the wadding, which I sometimes find easier because it just gives you something a little bit firmer and less flimsy to hold on. So my stitches will kind of go through the back of this as well. Okay, so I'm right-handed, so I start in the right-hand side, and I've got a knot on the end of my thread. I'm going to bring my needle just into that fold of fabric here. I'm going to try and bring it through the white section. There we go. And then this is the way I like to do it. I go into the background fabric, this in the sort of level where I came up on the top fabric, and then I take my needle parallel with the folded edge, and then bring it back up. So I'm just nipping the corner of the fold there, the edge of the fold, bring it through. And as that thread comes down, it secures the fabric in place. So I'll show you that again. I've come up onto my top fabric. I'm now going back into the background fabric, level with where my thread came up. I'm keeping my needle parallel with the edge of the fold, and then I'm coming back up and just catching the fold and then pulling the thread through. Okay, and as I'm going along, you can see that's starting to unfold a bit, so I just keep going and folding that over with my nail, so I'm not getting any little bumps into my fabric there. Sometimes you can tack that into place, especially if you're using a larger piece. I'd probably tack that into place, and then you're not worried about the thread getting caught in any pins, which can be irritating. There we go. You don't want to pull it too tight. You can see it sort of starts to buckle a little bit, so keep a reasonable tension, not too loose, not too tight. So again, you can see where my thread has come up. I'm going into the background, level with the thread, parallel with the folded edge, back up, very close to that fold, and then pulling it tight. And that's how I like to do needle turn applique. And when you choose a matching thread, it's practically invisible, and it just gives you that nice, crisp, solid line. Okay, last couple of stitches, and then I'm just going to go through to the back. Oops, there we go, see, caught on a pin. Okay, and then just to secure it down, I'm going to do a small stitch at the back, not going through to the front at all, just into that wadding. And then once again, just to make sure. There we go. So we've got a nice flat edge there. Now at this stage, if any of it had buckled up, I can just lay that flat again. What I'm going to do now is just secure this little bit down here, because I'm lazy. I don't want to cut it and knot it and start again. There we go, I'll remove that pin. So I'm just doing very, very rough stitches. It doesn't need to be too perfect, this one. Just securing it in place so it doesn't lift up, but I want that nice frayed edge. So as I'm making this, I'm looking at the two together and wondering if they do work as a pair. Typical. And this is quite natural, I'm sure many of you are the same, to have sort of lots of doubts as you're making your work, and you know, you go through stages of being really happy about it and really excited, and then adding something else and then questioning that decision, and that's part of the process. And often, yeah, it's tempting. Sometimes we just get annoyed with it and leave it, and sometimes that helps to give yourself a bit of space from the work, but more and more I'm just finding I just try and trust the process, and an answer usually arrives as I'm making. And this is just a really nice thing about slow stitching. You can be in the moment, and you can kind of have that dialogue with your work, and just notice any thoughts that you're having. There we go. That's enough. The rest of it is underneath this fabric, so I don't need to stitch that down. And then I'm going to do the same, just tie that at the back there. There's a relationship between the shapes and these kind of negative spaces. And maybe it will look more cohesive once I start adding stitch. I feel like when I put this dark line on, that did something. Maybe dark stitching would also bring them together. So I've had a play around with the composition, and I've added the blue and moved the mustard around in this one, and then added a little bit of mustard into this one, so that there are some common colour elements between both pieces. I nearly added this, but I felt like that was a little bit too much, so I think that's enough that we've got the blue and the mustard, and we've still got this sort of shape together. And then I'm hoping to further kind of bring it together when I add some stitching in. So I will go ahead and whip stitch down all of these edges in the same way that I've done with this one and this one. Okay, there we have two finished compositions, and all of the pieces of fabric have been whip stitched down, so they're nice and secure. And then there's slightly irregular shapes, which you might like and might want to make a feature of. I think I will just trim this one down slightly. if you want to be really neat, again, you can use a quilting ruler and a rotary cutter. And then the next thing I want to do is work out where to put some stitching. We look back at another pair. It's got less going on in the background, but I think the stitching just gives it that extra element. It's nice to kind of layer up a bit of pattern and texture. Or I could go through and do something quite densely stitched like this one. I'm not sure. What I like to do is kind of get my colours and just lay the threads on top and just see what works. So have another little play again, and there's lots of different lines I could go off here, so I might want to take some of the pinstripes and continue these along. I could outline some of these curves. I could have stitching maybe just in the background or to highlight a few of the shapes and then leave others plain. Or I could just stitch over the entire lot. So I'm just going to lay some threads over. Normally I tend to, if I'm hand quilting, these are my go-to colours. They seem to work really nicely on all of the background colours I use. I do like this sort of medium grey. It gives enough contrast, but it's not as stark as something like black. So I don't know what it is. I never go for black and white. It's usually like a charcoal and an ecru. So it still gives that contrast, but it's slightly softer. But no, don't like black. I am quite drawn to this blue, which might be quite fun. Yeah, it might be fun to kind of almost just have another element, like maybe I could couch that on top. That could be interesting. Do a little fun kind of just drop it and stitch it on where it is, and that line will kind of continue between the two. It's something to think about. And then this, I mean, this one hasn't got any of these oranges or rusty colours in, so that might be a way of bringing that in together. Do I want to go for something quite angular? It's also quite nice. So there are endless possibilities. There's nothing that says I have to choose one colour either. I could put some bolder lines in here, some stripes. Yeah, I don't know now. So hopefully my funny little back to front process is showing you that, yeah, you can have fun with it, you can ask questions, you don't have to know exactly what you're doing. Try things out and you might discover something exciting. Okay, a decision has been made. So I will quilt diagonal lines through this pinstripe here. And I wouldn't normally mark lines on, but I would quite like the contrast between a very straight stitch with these curves. So I'm just going to mark a few of them to give me a bit of a guideline. This is a Frixion pen, so you can remove this by using a hairdryer or using an iron. However, I have found on darker fabrics it tends to leave a slight light mark, and I've also heard stories that the pen can return in cold as well. So if you live in a very cold climate, it's possible that these lines might come back. So use with caution, and always test on a spare bit of fabric first, because the last thing you want is to ruin all of your lovely work by scribbling over it. And then it's just a matter of kind of rocking that needle back and forth, gathering all of the stitches on, and then pulling that through. And then with your tension, try not to pull it through too tightly so it doesn't distort, unless of course that's a feature that you want. And I'm not a very fast stitcher. I've seen some people, hand quilters and sashiko stitches are amazingly quick. And if you are, then that's good for you. But yeah, I take my time. And I'm not too bothered about it being, you know, really even or even gaps. But after a while, you kind of find the rhythm. So you naturally find your handwriting with your stitch length, really. When I get to the end, I just go to the bottom, so the needle comes out the other side, and I just come in back through this end, and then I can start the next row. So some people like to line up their stitches so that you'll get these nice kind of ripples that run evenly through. I'm just letting mine kind of do whatever they want to do, seeing what happens. Okay. Okay, last couple of stitches. And then I just secure that with a quilter's knot. Oops. Come here. There we go. So there we go. There's the two bits of grey running stitch hand quilting finished. And I'm quite happy with that. I don't really want to add any more texture. I want some contrast between these flat areas here. What I really would like to do is to go back to that idea about having a blue line over the top. Something that can kind of go off the edge, come back in. So I'm going to just lay the thread on top and see how that looks. So I'm not sure whether to follow that shape, whether that looks a bit contrived. Make it a bit bigger, and perhaps double the thread up to make a bolder line. Yeah, that's quite nice. And then there's a bit more contrast between the thickness of this stitch and then my hand quilted stitches. So I'm just going to use my Frixian pen to just sketch that in place. Roughly. Doesn't have to be too accurate. And I'm just going to make quite small stitches quite close together. And I just need to be careful when I'm pulling that through because I'm using double thread and one might be slightly longer than the other, so just keep checking your tension, check that things aren't getting tangled up. Tiny little stitches, gathering them on the needle and pulling through. So it's quite tough to pull through in some places because, you know, here there's 3 layers of fabric. On a larger quilt, what I do when I'm making the quilt top would be to turn it over and then cut away some of the backing fabric, because when you're quilting through something bigger, it can be quite tough on your fingers and your arms. So removing some of those layers makes that much easier. But on a smaller scale like this, it wouldn't really be worth going in and cutting away the back. It would leave some very tiny scraps. So on the other one, you can see the line is really solid compared to this broken line, and it's slightly textured as well. And that's where I've gone back through and stitched through those stitches. So I should have just enough thread here to go back round. I'm going to use the opposite end of the needle, and I'm just going to go back through each stitch I've done. And I'm using the opposite end because I don't need to pierce through any fabric, just need to literally wrap through those stitches, so the sharp edge could catch on and snag something, which obviously we don't want. So again, you don't want to pull it too tightly, otherwise that's going to cause it to gather. Sometimes you can do quite nice decorative stitches, like leaving it slightly loose and looping it, or you can kind of twist it and stitch it down in another way. Don't think that would work for this particular piece, but it's definitely something that can be explored. And I do like to use whip stitches quite a bit in my work if I want to add a stronger line. Sometimes a piece of work is just missing something, and adding a line in there somewhere just kind of ties it all together. And I sort of view this way of working as collage and mark making, which is all about, you know, different weights and different textures, different marks. So I don't see it as any different to painting or drawing, really. You're drawing with thread, you're drawing with fabric. I mean, I feel like this is quite a painterly composition, almost slightly Kandinsky maybe. So to bind our coaster, we need to place the top and the wadding, if you've not already sewn the wadding into it, and place that in the middle of your background square. Now, my top was 12 centimetres, the back was 16 centimetres, so that's a 2 centimetre overlap. That's about 3/4 of an inch if you're using imperial. And I find that's enough to just fold that in halfway and then fold that round, and that creates a nice slim border. And again, you know, you might have a contrasting fabric, or you might have chosen to go the same as the top. Both can work quite nicely. So I like to go with opposite sides. And when I'm folding the raw edge in, I don't go right to the edge because I find that kind of distorts the shape slightly. So I just leave a few millimetres and then just fold that over. Yeah, use pins or these handy little binding clips, which I like. And then that way you're not getting it caught on your thread again. There we go. So I sew these two first, and then I sew these two over, so it creates a folded edge. You can do a mitered corner if you like. I tend to use both actually. On this one I've used kind of square edges. On this one, mitered corners. I quite like the informality of these. We're not going to go through the back, so I'm going to start just in that wadding so the knot is hidden. and I've just started in that fold just there. So I'll do a few stitches close to the camera so you can see. So like when we did needle turn and plique, I've come up through the binding, then I'm going back in level with where the thread came out, and I'm holding my needle parallel to the fold, and as I'm bringing the needle up, I'm just catching that fold there, and I'm kind of using my nail as a guide for the width. So you can do them closer together or further apart. Yeah, try to keep them even, but it doesn't matter too much. So let's do that again. So going in to the background, keeping your needle level with the fold, and then just catching the corner and coming up. In level with the stitch, and then coming back up. And it just creates these really neat little tacks, and they're visible because I've used a thick thread and a contrasting colour, but if you wanted to make them invisible, you can do. Just use a finer thread and match that to your background. Just do a little stitch and tie it to itself. So just knot that through. I'm going to do it one more time just to secure it. Okay. That's quite like that little subtle pop of colour in the binding. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same on this side. Then we'll turn it around and then fold the other two sides. Just fold that in. So this is a linen, so it's quite easy to kind of press that with my fingers. You could use an iron if you wanted to get a really, really neat, sharp crease. So you might need to just bring that in at a slight angle because sometimes it overlaps and distorts. There we go, it's sitting a bit better now. Okay. And then the same on this side. So I start with my needle right in the corner. So I just come in at a diagonal angle. There we go. So any knot is hidden inside. So I'm going to take this off. And then same as before. Just getting the tip of the needle right into the corner. So the next one goes right into the corner. Oops. Okay, so there you can see 3 little stitches in the side, and then like we did before, I'm just going to go level with the fold and just start in the middle of the binding, so it's kind of in the middle of those two there. Bring that up. And remember, we're not going right through the back. So if you look at the back, there's no stitches because we're just going through the top of the quilt and slightly into the wadding. Okay, so this next stitch is going to come into two of those bindings there. Oops. Into the corner. So I might just double that stitch there to keep that down. There we go. So my needle's going along that fold there and coming up. Going here. Right into the corner. And then one final one here. So I knot that off. Pull that nice and tight. And then I sew that back through the binding. Just give that a trim here. There we go, we've got 3 sides done. Let's go ahead and finish that last edge. Okay, so here's both finished coasters, nicely binded. No stitches going through the back. And I'm just going to give them a slight press. That'll get rid of any pen and then flatten it up slightly. 2 abstract coasters or mini quilts made from scrap fabrics using raw edge plique, needle turn applique, hand quilting, whip stitches, and then binding with the back of the fabric, and then using a visible whip stitch. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for sewing along with me. I really hope you enjoyed that workshop. If you are interested in my artwork, you can find out more on my website, www.rebekahjohnston.co.uk, or on my Instagram as Rebekah, that's REBEKAH_handmade.